Most people remember Lost in Space as a lighthearted, almost campy adventure featuring the Robinson family drifting aimlessly through the stars. However, behind the stoic leadership of John Robinson and the calm strength of Maureen, a much darker and more complex story was unfolding off-screen. Actors like Bill Mumy and Angela Cartwright later admitted that the polished episodes viewers saw each week were only a small fraction of the chaotic reality on set. Decisions were made in secret, professional tensions simmered beneath the surface, and the entire creative direction of the show quietly shifted in ways that most casual fans never truly noticed. Once you delve into what the cast revealed decades later, it becomes increasingly clear that this series was never intended to be the show we remember today. It was a project born of high-minded ambition that was eventually swallowed by the demands of commercial television and the gravitational pull of a single, unexpected breakout character. To understand the real Lost in Space, one must look past the silver jumpsuits and the blinking lights of the Jupiter 2. When the series first premiered, it wasn't designed to be the colorful, often ridiculous sci-fi spectacle that defined late 1960s television. The original concept, spearheaded by Irwin Allen, was far more serious, grounded in a clear and noble mission. It was envisioned as a futuristic version of the Swiss Family Robinson, centered on a carefully selected group of intellectuals traveling across the void to colonize a new world near Alpha Centauri. The Robinsons were not meant to be caricatures or participants in a weekly space circus. They were the protagonists of a long-form survival story exploring the weight of responsibility and the psychological toll of isolation. At the heart of this vision was Professor John Robinson, played by the disciplined Guy Williams, a leader whose tactical decisions were meant to carry life-or-death consequences. Alongside him was Maureen Robinson, portrayed by June Lockhart, who was written not just as a supportive housewife, but as a brilliant, highly trained biochemist capable of contributing scientifically to the family's survival. The structure of the show in its earliest stages reflected a delicate balance between scientific intellect and the raw danger of the unknown. However, the reality behind the scenes began to shift almost immediately after the cameras started rolling. According to later reflections from the cast, the show did not debut as an instant phenomenon. In fact, early audience reactions were somewhat underwhelming, and network executives at CBS had very little initial confidence that the series would survive its first season. It wasn't until several weeks into the run that ratings began a surprising climb into the top 10. When the numbers finally spoke, the executives didn't just offer support, they began to intervene. This was the exact moment where the original DNA of the show was altered forever. Instead of leaning into the serious, dramatic tone that Allen had initially pitched, producers began to experiment with a broader, more juvenile appeal to secure their newfound audience. As the scripts moved away from survival and toward spectacle, the emotional weight of the journey began to dissolve. The original mission of reaching Alpha Centauri slowly faded into the background, replaced by increasingly exaggerated situations and encounters with unusual, often rubber-suited creatures. The cast noticed the change long before the public did. Scripts started to feel inconsistent, and the logical trajectory of the family's journey became secondary to the monster of the week formula. For an actor like Guy Williams, who had been promised a high-stakes drama, seeing his character reduced to a secondary figure in a chaotic space comedy was a bitter pill to swallow. The series was becoming disconnected from its own premise, drifting into a surreal narrative landscape where the stakes felt lower and the humor felt forced. This transition wasn't an accident, it was a calculated pivot to keep the show on the air at any cost. What truly altered the trajectory of Lost in Space was not a network mandate or a visual effect, but the creative rebellion of one specific actor. Jonathan Harris was originally hired to play Dr. Zachary Smith as a cold, calculating saboteur, a villain whose actions were meant to provide a brief catalyst for the family's predicament. In the earliest drafts, Smith was never intended to be a permanent fixture. He was a one-dimensional antagonist meant to be phased out once the ship was well and truly lost. However, Harris, a veteran of the stage with a keen sense of self-preservation, immediately spotted a flaw in that plan. He realized that a purely evil character would quickly become tiresome in a weekly format and would eventually be written off. To save his job, Harris began to subversively rewrite the character from the inside out, injecting a layer of theatricality and comedic cowardice that was never on the page. Harris's transformation of Dr. Smith was subtle at first but grew bolder with each passing episode. He began adding flamboyant flair to his delivery, exaggerating his physical reactions, and developing a sophisticated vocabulary of insults for the robot. He took the cold saboteur and turned him into an entertaining, manipulative, and deeply human coward. He famously admitted later that he would lie in bed at night inventing alliterative insults like bubble-headed booby and blithering blatherskite. none of which were in the original scripts. This creative autonomy effectively hijacked the show. The writers, seeing how much the audience responded to Harris's performance, began tailoring entire episodes around Smith's latest schemes rather than the Robinson family's survival. This shift created a new, unofficial trio at the heart of the show: Dr. Smith, Will Robinson, and the robot. This new dynamic provided the show with its most memorable moments, but it came at a significant cost to the rest of the ensemble. Guy Williams found his role as the central authority figure steadily diminishing. Scenes that were once intended to showcase John Robinson's leadership were trimmed or cut entirely to make room for Dr. Smith's comedic monologues. Mark Goddard, who played Major Don West, also felt the squeeze. His character, positioned as the action hero foil to Smith's cowardice, found less and less meaningful development as the show leaned into camp. The tension on set wasn't necessarily explosive, but a quiet sense of disillusionment began to permeate the cast. They were professionals, so they continued to deliver, but the sense of being part of a prestigious science fiction epic had largely evaporated, replaced by the grueling reality of a high-paced, low-logic television production. The shift toward the Smith-centric format was a commercial masterstroke, but a narrative disaster for those who valued consistency. As the tone shifted, the logic of the show became increasingly porous. Scientific accuracy was thrown out the window in favor of visual gags and surreal plot twists. The Robinson family, originally a team of experts, often seemed relegated to being spectators in their own story. Despite the internal frustrations, the ratings remained robust. The more outrageous and campy Dr. Smith became, the more the show appealed to a younger demographic. This success justified the producers' decisions in the short term, but it created a fundamental identity crisis for the series. It was a show caught between two worlds: the serious sci-fi drama it was supposed to be and the colorful space pantomime it had become. Behind this tonal shift was the iron will of producer Irwin Allen. Known as the Master of Disaster, Allen was a visionary who understood the spectacle of television, but he was also an incredibly demanding and controlling figure. To Allen, the show was a product that needed to be sold, and if that meant abandoning the original vision for something more profitable, he wouldn't hesitate. He ran the set with a megaphone and a stopwatch, constantly pushing the cast and crew to work faster and cheaper. His directing style was unconventional, to say the least. He would often stand off-camera, banging on metal objects to simulate the shaking of the ship, shouting instructions at the actors to lurch from side to side. It was a low-tech, high-pressure environment where the illusion of space travel was maintained through sheer physical effort rather than sophisticated technology. The cast, particularly the younger members like Bill Mumy and Angela Cartwright, recalled a work environment that was both magical and exhausting. Allen's obsession with packing meant that there was little time for character exploration or nuanced performances. Everything was about the now: the next monster, the next explosion, the next cliffhanger. This frantic energy translated to the screen, giving Lost in Space a manic quality that separated it from more contemplative shows like Star Trek. While Gene Roddenberry was trying to use sci-fi to explore social issues, Irwin Allen was trying to use it to keep children glued to their television sets on a Wednesday night. This fundamental difference in philosophy is why Lost in Space is often remembered more for its aesthetic and its catchphrases than its storytelling. As the production budget began to tighten in the later seasons, the strain of Allen's spectacle-first approach became even more apparent. Sets were recycled, costumes were repurposed from other 20th Century Fox productions, and the writing became even more erratic. The show was eating itself, relying on a shrinking pool of resources to deliver increasingly bizarre scenarios. Yet through it all, the chemistry between Mumy, Harris, and the robot remained the show's saving grace. It was a strange, accidental alchemy that kept the series afloat even when the scripts failed. This trio provided a heart to the show that the original, serious concept might have lacked. The bond between the precocious boy and the cowardly doctor became the defining relationship of the series, transcending the campy trappings. Looking back, the evolution of Lost in Space serves as a fascinating case study in the volatile nature of early television production. It was a show that was hijacked by its own success and redefined by an actor who refused to be forgotten. While many fans still mourn the serious survivalist drama that might have been, it's hard to deny that the version we got, the chaotic, colorful, and deeply weird adventure, is what made it a permanent part of pop culture history. The show didn't fail because it changed. It survived because it was flexible enough to become whatever the audience needed it to be. However, as we will see in the next chapter, that very flexibility eventually led to a financial and creative wall that not even Dr. Smith could charm his way past. The behind-the-scenes tensions were not just limited to the actors' roles, they extended to the very physical nature of the production. The Jupiter 2 set was a marvel of its time, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, yet the actors often felt like they were working in a claustrophobic pressure cooker. The heat from the studio lights, combined with the heavy costumes and the constant shouting from the director's booth, created a grueling atmosphere. This physical strain contributed to the sense of exhaustion that some cast members felt by the third season. It wasn't just the scripts that were changing, the very act of making the show was becoming a trial of endurance. This reality is often lost on fans who see only the bright colors and the smiling faces of the Robinson family on their screens. Furthermore, the influence of the network cannot be overstated. CBS was in a constant battle for ratings dominance, and they viewed Lost in Space as a primary weapon in their arsenal. They weren't interested in artistic integrity, they were interested in eyes on screens. This pressure trickled down from the executives to Irwin Allen and ultimately to the writers. Every time a new weird element was introduced, like a giant carrot man or a space circus, it was a direct response to a perceived need for more hooks to keep the audience engaged. This reactionary style of production is what led to the show's reputation for being inconsistent and bizarre. It was a show written by committee and edited by the bottom line. Despite these hurdles, the legacy of the show persists because it captured something essential about the era's imagination. It was a time of immense technological optimism and hidden anxieties about the Cold War and the unknown. Lost in Space played into both, offering a safe, familial environment where even the most terrifying alien could be outsmarted by a smart kid and a robot. The show's transition into camp was, in many ways, a reflection of the culture moving from the rigid 1950s into the psychedelic 1960s. It embraced the absurdity of the time, making it a perfect, if accidental, time capsule. The actors themselves became symbols of this transition. Guy Williams, the dashing hero of Zorro, became the frustrated father figure of a show that didn't need him. Jonathan Harris, the character actor, became a cult icon. Bill Mumy, the child star, grew up in front of millions, navigating the strange world of Hollywood sci-fi. Their personal stories are inextricably linked to the show's DNA, and their later admissions provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. They weren't just playing roles, they were surviving a production that was constantly shifting beneath their feet. This human element is what gives the show its lasting resonance. As we move into the second part of this analysis, we will explore the specific financial pressures and network politics that ultimately brought the journey of the Jupiter 2 to an abrupt and unceremonious end. We will see how a series that was still popular could be canceled in a heartbeat, and how the spectacle that Irwin Allen loved so much eventually became his show's undoing. The story of Lost in Space is a story of ambition, ego, and the cold reality of the television business. It is a reminder that even in the vastness of space, the most dangerous things are often the ones happening right behind the camera. The show's influence can still be seen in modern sci-fi, from the way we conceptualize robots to the tropes of the dysfunctional family in space. Every reboot and reimagining owes a debt to the original's chaotic energy. Whether you prefer the serious pilot or the campy third season, there's no denying that the show left an indelible mark. But the real story, the one involving budget cuts, megaphone-wielding producers, and rewritten villains, is far more interesting than any script the writers ever turned in. It's a story of how a failed, serious drama became a successful comedic masterpiece and the price that was paid by everyone involved. In the end, Lost in Space remains a testament to the power of personality in television. Without Jonathan Harris, the show would likely have been a forgotten footnote in TV history. With him, it became a legend. But that legend was built on the ruins of Guy Williams' career and the original vision of a serious space exploration epic. The irony is that the very things that made the show unforgettable were the same things that made it unsustainable. The balance between art and commerce is always delicate, and Lost in Space is perhaps the most famous example of what happens when that balance is completely ignored in favor of the wow factor. As we conclude this first part, consider the Robinson family not just as explorers of Alpha Centauri, but as explorers of a new frontier in media. They were the first family to navigate the transition from prestige drama to commercial spectacle, and they did it while wearing silver foil and dodging giant space monsters. Their journey was never what it seemed, and the truth behind the scenes is the most fascinating adventure of all. The stars were just the beginning. The real drama was always happening inside the ship, between the takes, and in the minds of the people who brought this impossible world to life. In the next 20 paragraphs, we will dive deep into the specific Monster of the Week era and the internal mechanics of Irwin Allen's production house. We will look at how the robot became more than just a prop, and how the relationship between Will and Dr. Smith became a template for sidekick dynamics for decades to come. The journey continues, and the secrets of the Jupiter 2 are only just beginning to be revealed. Stay tuned as we unmask the master of disaster and the financial collapse that finally grounded the Robinsons forever. Part 2: The Spectacle and the Strain. The second phase of Lost in Space was defined by an almost obsessive focus on the Monster of the Week formula, a creative direction that pushed the show into the realm of the surreal. As the budget for practical effects stayed relatively stagnant while the ambitions of Irwin Allen grew, the production team was forced to become masters of improvisation. This period saw the introduction of some of the most bizarre creatures ever to grace the small screen, from the infamous giant carrot to various multi-limbed entities that were often just actors in poorly ventilated rubber suits. For the cast, this meant spending long hours on set interacting with props that were frequently falling apart or repurposed from other Fox sets. The serious sci-fi tone of the first season was now a distant memory, replaced by a vibrant, neon-colored aesthetic that prioritized visual impact over narrative logic. This era of the show was also when the robot, voiced by Dick Tufeld and operated by Bob May, truly came into its own as a character. Originally intended to be a mindless tool, the robot began to display a distinct personality, often acting as the voice of reason or the reluctant accomplice to Dr. Smith's schemes. The dynamic between the robot and Smith became the show's most reliable source of entertainment. The B9 environmental control robot wasn't just a piece of machinery, it was a scene partner. Bob May's physical acting inside the heavy, restrictive suit was a feat of endurance that rarely gets the credit it deserves. He had to coordinate his movements with Tufeld's pre-recorded lines, creating a seamless performance that made the robot feel like a living, breathing member of the crew. However, as the show became more fun for younger viewers, the work environment became increasingly difficult for the adults. The shift toward camp meant that the scripts often made little sense, even by sci-fi standards. Logic gaps were filled with explosions or Dr. Smith's frantic stalling. For Guy Williams and June Lockhart, the lack of character growth was a constant source of frustration. They were playing mother and father in a world where the children and the villain were the only ones allowed to have adventures. The professional distance between the serious actors and the comedic ones grew, though they remained a cohesive unit for the sake of the production. They were all trapped in Irwin Allen's high-pressure orbit, and they knew it. Irwin Allen's production style during this period was characterized by a more is more philosophy. He believed that the audience would forgive any narrative flaw as long as there was something exciting to look at. This led to a frantic pace of filming, with episodes being churned out with little regard for the actors' comfort. The use of the megaphone was not just a quirk, it was a tool of command. Allen would use it to cut through the noise of the studio, keeping everyone on their toes. The constant pressure to perform under these conditions meant that the cast developed a shorthand with one another, a defensive camaraderie born of surviving the Irwin Allen experience. They were a family off-screen as much as on-screen, bound by the shared absurdity of their daily lives. The recycling of props and sets became a hallmark of this era. A cave set might be used for 5 different planets in a single season, with only a change in lighting or a few plastic plants to distinguish them. This wasn't just a cost-cutting measure, it was a necessity of the grueling television schedule. The production design team had to be incredibly creative, turning everyday objects into futuristic technology. Fans often joke about the blinking lights that served no purpose, but those lights were essential for creating the illusion of a high-tech environment on a shoestring budget. The Jupiter 2 was a masterpiece of smoke and mirrors, a set that looked far more impressive on camera than it did in person. As the show entered its third season, the transition to full-color broadcasting allowed Allen to push the visual spectacle even further. The colors became more saturated and the costumes more elaborate. However, the cracks were starting to show. The scripts were becoming repetitive, and the Dr. Smith gets into trouble and will saves him trope was being worn thin. Even Jonathan Harris, who loved the role, began to feel the limitations of the character. He had created a monster that he now had to feed every week. The demand for more insults, more cowardice, and more schemes was relentless. The show had found a winning formula, but it was a formula that left little room for innovation. The impact on the younger cast members was also significant. Bill Mumy, as Will Robinson, was effectively the show's hero. He was the one who solved the problems, operated the technology, and navigated the emotional minefield of Dr. Smith's personality. For a young actor, this was an immense responsibility. Mumy handled it with remarkable grace, but the pressure of being the show's moral and intellectual center took its toll. He spent more time with Jonathan Harris and the robot than he did with his own age peers. This unique upbringing in the spotlight of a space-age fantasy shaped his worldview in ways that he would only fully articulate years later in his memoirs. Despite the internal strains, Lost in Space remained a pillar of the CBS Wednesday night lineup. It was a show that families watched together, even if they were watching it for different reasons. Children loved the gadgets and the monsters, while adults appreciated the theatricality of Dr. Smith. It was a safe show during a time of great social upheaval. While the news was filled with reports from Vietnam and the civil rights movement, the Robinsons offered a predictable, if chaotic, escape. This escapism was the secret to the show's longevity, even as its creative spark began to dim. It provided a sense of wonder that was increasingly rare in the gritty landscape of late 60s television. Behind the scenes, the financial reality was becoming unavoidable. Each episode was costing more to produce, while the revenue from advertising was becoming less certain. The shift toward a younger audience meant that the prestige advertisers were moving elsewhere. Irwin Allen was caught in a trap of his own making. He had built a show that relied on expensive spectacle but had alienated the audience that paid for it. The network was starting to look at the show not as a creative asset but as a line item on a balance sheet. And the numbers were no longer adding up. The cost of the Jupiter 2, the salaries of the large ensemble cast, and the ever-increasing demands for special effects were creating a financial black hole. The tension between Allen and the network executives finally came to a head during the negotiations for a fourth season. The network wanted to cut the budget significantly, a move that Allen saw as a personal insult. He refused to compromise on the quality of the spectacle, believing that a cheap version of the show would be its death knell. In a moment of high-stakes brinkmanship, Allen stood his ground, likely expecting the network to blink first. But the television landscape was changing. Newer, cheaper-to-produce shows were proving to be just as popular, and the space craze of the mid-60s was beginning to wane as the real-life moon landing approached. The network didn't blink, they simply canceled the show. The cancellation was so abrupt that it left the cast and crew in a state of shock. There was no series finale, no closure for the Robinson family, and no resolution to the mission. They were quite literally lost in space forever. Scripts for the fourth season were discarded and the expensive sets were dismantled. For many involved, it felt like an unfinished symphony. They had spent 3 years building this world, only to have it vanish overnight because of a budget dispute. The silent end of the series is one of the great what-ifs of television history. What would a fourth season have looked like? Would they have finally reached Alpha Centauri? We will never know. In the years following the cancellation, the cast struggled to distance themselves from the show's legacy. Guy Williams, feeling that Hollywood had pigeonholed him, eventually moved to Argentina where he was still revered as Zorro. He sought a life of peace and anonymity, far from the megaphone and the rubber monsters. June Lockhart continued to work, but she was forever Maureen Robinson in the eyes of the public. The typecasting that affected the cast was a testament to how deeply the show had permeated the cultural consciousness. They weren't just actors, they were the Robinsons, a family that millions of people felt they knew personally. Jonathan Harris, interestingly, was the one who embraced the legacy most fully. He understood that Dr. Smith was his greatest creation, and he delighted in meeting fans and reprising the voice of the character in various media. He became the unofficial ambassador for the show, keeping the flame alive through decades of conventions and interviews. His later life success as a voice actor was a direct result of the distinctive persona he had crafted on the Jupiter 2. He proved that even a villain could become a beloved icon if played with enough heart and wit. Harris's story is one of creative triumph over the limitations of the medium. The Robot 2 became a cultural touchstone. Its design, created by Robert Kinoshita, who also designed Robbie the Robot from Forbidden Planet, remains one of the most recognizable in sci-fi history. The phrase "Danger, Will Robinson" entered the lexicon as a universal warning, transcending the show itself. The robot represented the intersection of technology and humanity, a theme that remains as relevant today as it was in 1965. The fact that a man in a rubber and plastic suit could evoke such a strong emotional response is a tribute to the craftsmanship of everyone involved, from the designers to the performers. As we look back at the spectacle era of Lost in Space, we see a show that was both a product of its time and ahead of it. It anticipated the fandom culture that would later define shows like Star Trek and Star Wars. It showed that characters and catchphrases could be more important than plot or logic. It was a show that thrived on the edge of disaster, both on-screen and off-screen. The strain of the production was the very thing that gave it its unique, frenetic energy. It was a beautiful, chaotic mess that shouldn't have worked, yet somehow, it became unforgettable. The human cost of this spectacle was real, however. The professional frustrations of Williams and Goddard, the physical exhaustion of May, and the creative pressures on Mummy and Harris are the hidden story of the show. They were the ones who made the impossible seem real, often at the expense of their own career aspirations. Their dedication to the show, even when the scripts were at their most absurd, is what allowed Lost in Space to endure. They treated the nonsense with the same professionalism as they would a Shakespearean play, and that sincerity is what the audience responded to. The legacy of Irwin Allen is also a complex one. He was a man who understood the circus of television better than almost anyone. He knew how to grab an audience's attention and hold it. While he may have lacked the high-concept vision of a Roddenberry or the narrative depth of a Serling, he possessed a raw, cinematic instinct that made his shows visually arresting. He was the grandfather of the modern blockbuster, prioritizing the big moment above all else. Lost in Space was his greatest laboratory, a place where he could test the limits of what television could achieve on a weekly basis. In the end, the spectacle and the strain of Lost in Space created a television icon. It was a show that was born in the shadows of the Cold War, grew up in the neon glow of the 60s, and died in a boardroom in New York. Its journey was as unpredictable as the flight of the Jupiter 2 itself. But for the fans, the real story is found in the moments of genuine connection between the characters, the bond between a boy and his robot, the bickering between a doctor and a major, and the enduring strength of a family lost among the stars. These are the things that no budget cut could ever take away. As we move into the final part of this documentary analysis, we will look at the long-term impact of the show on the cast's lives and the broader culture. We will examine how Lost in Space paved the way for future sci-fi epics and why, despite its campy reputation, it remains a beloved classic. The Robinson family's mission may have been cut short, but their influence continues to expand, reaching new generations of fans who are just discovering the magic, the monsters, and the mystery of the Jupiter 2. The final 20 paragraphs will conclude this journey, offering a definitive look at the afterlife of the series and the final reflections of the people who lived it. From the quiet streets of Buenos Aires to the bustling halls of sci-fi conventions, the story of Lost in Space is a saga that spans decades. It is a story of what happens when the cameras stop rolling and the actors have to find their own way home. The journey to Alpha Centauri may have failed, but the journey of the human spirit in the face of the unknown is one that never truly ends. Part 3: The Legacy and the Final Frontier. The aftermath of Lost in Space left a void in the lives of its cast that many struggled to fill. For an ensemble that had spent 3 years in such close, high-pressure proximity, the transition back to normal Hollywood life was jarring. The show had been a cultural juggernaut, but its campy reputation in the later seasons made it difficult for some actors to be taken seriously for dramatic roles. Guy Williams, who had embodied the quintessential hero for a generation, found himself at a crossroads. He was deeply proud of his work but frustrated by the industry's narrow view of his talents. His decision to retire to Argentina was not a flight from failure, but a search for a different kind of fulfillment. In South America, he was treated with the dignity of a legend living a life that was both grounded and regal, far removed from the megaphone-driven chaos of Irwin Allen's sets. For June Lockhart, the end of the series was simply another chapter in an illustrious career. She proved that a professional can survive even the most surreal production with their dignity intact. Her transition to Petticoat Junction and her subsequent roles in film and television cemented her status as a versatile performer. But it was her real-life connection to NASA that perhaps defined her later years most poignantly. She became an ambassador for space exploration, bridging the gap between the fantasy of the Jupiter 2 and the reality of the Apollo missions. She showed that the Maureen Robinson character was built on a foundation of genuine intelligence and curiosity, qualities she carried with her until the very end of her long and remarkable life. The younger cast members, Bill Mumy and Angela Cartwright, faced the unique challenge of being former child stars. They had grown up in a world of silver jumpsuits and alien planets, and finding their identity outside of that world took time. Bill Mumy in particular leveraged his experience into a multifaceted career as a musician, writer, and voice actor. He remained a fierce defender of the show's legacy, often collaborating with Jonathan Harris in later years. Angela Cartwright moved into the world of photography and art, finding a creative outlet that was entirely her own. They both maintained a deep, lifelong friendship, a testament to the family bond that had been forged under the watchful eye of the master of disaster. Jonathan Harris, meanwhile, became the living embodiment of the show's enduring popularity. He didn't just survive the character of Dr. Smith, he conquered it. He understood that in the world of pop culture, a well-defined character is immortal. He spent his later years traveling the world, delighting fans with his sharp wit and his seemingly endless supply of anecdotes from the set. He was a man who loved the spotlight, and he used it to ensure that Lost in Space would never be forgotten. His marriage of over 60 years provided the stability that his chaotic on-screen persona lacked, showing a man of deep loyalty and character behind the comedic mask. The story of Mark Goddard is perhaps the most grounded of all. After a period of continued acting, he realized that his true calling lay elsewhere. He pursued education with the same intensity he had brought to the role of Major Don West, eventually becoming a beloved teacher for students with special needs. This career shift was a powerful statement about his values. He didn't need the applause of a studio audience to feel successful. He found fulfillment in the progress of his students. He remained connected to his Lost in Space family, but his life was defined by the impact he made in the classroom, a legacy that is arguably more profound than any television role. Bob May and Dick Tufeld, the two men who brought the robot to life, shared a unique bond. They were the invisible stars of the show, yet their contribution was the most iconic. Bob May's dedication to the physical performance, even as his health declined in later years, showed a deep respect for the fans who loved the character. Dick Tufeld's voice became the sound of 1960s sci-fi, a calm, authoritative presence in a world of chaos. They both participated in the 1998 feature film reboot, a passing of the torch that acknowledged their essential roles in the original series' success. Their work proved that a character could be iconic even if the actor's face was never seen. The broader cultural impact of Lost in Space cannot be overstated. It was one of the first shows to prove that science fiction could be a mainstream success on television. It paved the way for the family-centric sci-fi that would follow, from Battlestar Galactica to the modern reboots of the 2000s and 2010s. The show's influence is seen in every smart-mouthed robot and reluctant villain that has appeared since. It taught a generation of children to look at the stars with a sense of wonder and humor. While it may have lacked the philosophical depth of its contemporaries, it possessed a raw, imaginative energy that resonated with the spirit of the 1960s. The financial collapse of the show serves as a cautionary tale for the industry. It was a reminder that even the most popular shows are subject to the cold logic of the balance sheet. The silent cancellation of Lost in Space marked the end of an era of high-budget, spectacle-driven television produced by independent visionaries like Irwin Allen. As the networks moved toward more standardized, cost-effective programming, the Wild West days of early sci-fi production came to an end. The Jupiter 2 was grounded not by an alien force, but by the rising cost of production and the changing tastes of advertisers. Yet in the world of syndication, the show found a second life. For decades after its original run, Lost in Space was a staple of afternoon television, introducing new generations to the Robinson family. This afterlife is what truly cemented the show's status as a classic. Free from the pressures of network ratings and budget disputes, viewers could appreciate the show for what it was, a colorful, imaginative adventure that didn't take itself too seriously. The campiness that had frustrated the cast in the 60s became a source of charm for audiences in the 80s and 90s. The show had finally found its perfect frequency. The 1998 film and the 2018 Netflix series further proved the durability of the original concept. Each reimagining brought something new to the table. The film leaned into the darker, more serious roots of the pilot, while the Netflix series combined modern production values with a deep respect for the original characters. These reboots were only possible because the 1965 original had built such a strong foundation. The Robinson family is a brand that has survived for over 60 years, a feat that few other television properties can claim. It is a testament to the universal appeal of the story, a family trying to find their way home in a vast and dangerous universe. Looking back at the real story of Lost in Space, we see a complex tapestry of human ambition, creative compromise, and accidental genius. It was a show that was constantly at war with itself: serious vs campy, leadership versus cowardice, spectacle versus budget. This internal conflict is what gave the show its unique texture. It wasn't a perfect series, but it was a memorable one. The cast's reflections years later added a layer of depth and humanity to a show that could have easily been forgotten as a trivial piece of 60s fluff. They revealed the heart and the hustle that went into every frame of the Jupiter 2's journey. The tension between Guy Williams and Jonathan Harris, though professional, reflected the show's own identity crisis. Williams represented the old Hollywood leading man, stoic, disciplined, and heroic. Harris represented the new Hollywood character actor, fluid, comedic, and unpredictable. The fact that the show shifted so heavily toward Harris's style is a microcosm of how television itself was evolving during that period. It was moving away from the rigid archetypes of the 1950s and toward the more experimental, personality-driven content of the 70s. Lost in Space was the bridge between those two eras. Irwin Allen's legacy remains a point of debate among fans. Was he a visionary who pushed the boundaries of what was possible, or a ruthless producer who valued profit over art? The truth, as always, is likely somewhere in the middle. He was a man of his time, operating in a system that demanded results. Without his drive and his willingness to take risks, the show would never have made it to the screen in the first place. His master of disaster persona was a necessary armor in the brutal world of network television. He built a universe that lasted long after he was gone, and for that, he deserves a place in the history books. The Robinson family themselves, John, Maureen, Judy, Penny, and Will, remain icons of a specific kind of American optimism. They were the pioneers of the space age, carrying the values of the frontier into the galaxy. Even when the show was at its most ridiculous, the central theme of family first remained intact. This emotional core is why the show is remembered with such affection. It wasn't about the monsters or the planets, it was about the people on the ship and how they looked out for one another. In a world that often felt like it was falling apart, the Robinsons were a constant. As we reach the conclusion of this analysis, we are reminded that the real Lost in Space was never just what we saw on our television screens. It was a production filled with quiet struggles, bold reinventions, and a level of physical and creative dedication that is rare in any era. The cast didn't just play roles, they inhabited a world that was being built and rebuilt around them every day. Their story is a reminder that the most compelling dramas are often the ones that happen when the director calls cut. The journey of the Jupiter 2 may have been fictional, but the journey of the people who made it was very real. The show's end was not a failure of imagination, but a victim of its own success. It became too big for the box it was in, but in breaking that box, it scattered its influence across the culture, inspiring writers, directors, and scientists for decades to come. The lost episodes, the scrapped scripts, and the silent cancellation are all part of the mythos now. They add to the sense of mystery that surrounds the show, making it a subject of endless fascination for historians and fans alike. The show that was never meant to be this way became exactly what it needed to be. In the final accounting, Lost in Space is a triumph of the human spirit. It's about actors making the best of a changing landscape, a producer pushing the limits of technology, and a character who refused to be a villain. It's a story of survival in every sense of the word. The Robinson family may have never reached Alpha Centauri, but they reached something much more important: immortality in the hearts of millions. They are the eternal wanderers, the family that will always be just one planet away from home, and we are lucky to have been part of their journey. So as we look back at the blinking lights and the silver suits, we can see the real story shining through. It's a story of courage, humor, and a little bit of madness. It's the story of a show that defined a generation and then quietly disappeared into the stars, leaving behind a legacy that is as vast as space itself. The mission was never truly about colonizing a new world, it was about the adventure of getting there, and what an adventure it was. The Robinson family is still out there, somewhere in the static of old television signals, reminding us that even when we are lost, we are never truly alone. The journey concludes here, but the conversation about Lost in Space will continue as long as people look at the night sky and wonder, what if? The truth revealed by the cast decades later didn't ruin the magic, it only made it more impressive. It showed that behind every fun adventure is a group of people working incredibly hard to make the impossible look easy. That is the real magic of television, and the real secret of the Jupiter 2. The stars may be cold and distant, but the stories we tell about them are filled with warmth, wit, and the enduring power of family. In the end, Lost in Space